Ray Russell is the publisher for Tartarus Press. His new novel is The Woman Who Fell to Earth. Thank you for joining me, Ray.
It's really lovely to talk to you again.
You know, Ray, back in about 1970, a young folk singer, Carly Simon, was waiting for a date with Cat Stevens, who is now, once again, had resurgence of popularity. I used to buy his albums and they sounded good then. They still sound good now. But as she was waiting, she was kept waiting. He was running late. And so she wrote a song. That song was a hit on her first album called Anticipation. I'm not a big Carly Simon fan, to be honest. I mean, or of that kind of rock. That said, that song and her, giant hit, You're So Vain, which is ostensibly about Mick Jagger, who shows up in your new novel briefly. Both they have stuck with me. And in particular, it's the refrain from a Carly Simon song that it goes out on. And she says, "These are the good old days." And that is such a poignant reminder of regret and understanding. And I think that that's really at the core of this novel. You use the supernatural to explore the things we could have done, the things we did do, how they felt then, how they seem in the past, how they must seem when they're still in the future. And you do it so beautifully. Talk about creating it, just encountering the idea for this novel and choosing, this kind of mixture of nostalgia, regret, what we could have done, what we might have done for a topic that you turn into a page-turning thriller.
Well, I wasn't entirely sure that was necessarily what I was going to be writing about, because when I start writing, I don't plan novels out. And I find out what's going on as I go along. And I think things that are in my head, my interests and preoccupations, sort of come out without me necessarily realizing. So yes, I mean, nostalgia is a very, very powerful thing. And I don't think it's a bad thing. If you're actually in a good place yourself, looking back nostalgically can be great. It's when you're not happy with the present, nostalgia can be quite dangerous, I think. And you can start to think of the good old times and imagine that they were better than they were. But I've also recently written a couple of biographies, and I'm very aware that people kind of reinvent their past. Or in fact, both the writers that I've been researching, Robert Aikman and T. Lobsang Rampa, both wrote quite a lot of autobiographical work. And they are very careful about what they choose to write about, and aren't always entirely honest about what's happened. And that kind of obviously fed into the novel, because I do have a character who is writing some autobiographical notes, and she's kind of pinching someone else's history and making someone else's history her own. And I think we can all be in danger of doing that, because we all, when we talk about the past, tend to sort of idealize certain things, and we have shortcuts, and we remember the good times, not the bad times, or vice versa. We aren't good at actually, say, objectively remembering our own pasts.
One of the things that just caught me right out of the gate in this novel are the characters, Tanya and Tom. Tanya's voice is just so wonderful. And I think this is true of all the characters in this book. You kind of like them, but they're all kind of screwed up in some way. And I think that makes them just really a joy to read, because I found, I didn't think that they were better than me. I thought they're kind of, the way they were screwed up reminds me of the way I guess I am, and maybe many people are. They're kind of filled with regret, and they're always wondering, well, maybe it could be better.
I think we're all like that. It's always very tempting to have characters who are kind of caricatures, sort of larger than life. But to make a character that isn't yourself, you're not trying to project yourself, even though you as the writer are going to be in there, it's a delicate balance. You don't want to overdo it. And I don't know. I think the Catherine character is my favourite in it. The mad bookwoman, because I've known quite a lot of people like that, and I think there's probably more of me in that to a certain extent in her character.
Now, one of the things I think that's fascinating about this book is the way it begins. It begins literally with a bang,
Mm.
and so an event that is admittedly by all the characters they're trying to figure it out, but they can't. And I really like that nobody's got like some grand explanation at first. So talk about the inciting event in this novel, and choosing it to begin the novel in such a way.
Well, as I say, I don't plan anything out, and I had no idea whether it was going to end up being a novel or just a short story. So when the characters are woken up in the middle of the night by a crash on their roof, and they run out to see what's landed on their house, I didn't actually know what was going to have landed on their house. And when they start to suspect that actually it's a body, and do they recognize that body? I was thinking, well, who on earth is it? And the character started appearing. So admittedly, I was trying to write something which would sort of grab people's attention. And it kind of flowed naturally from there. I like the idea of putting characters in slightly fantastic situations and then having them try and work out what happens next in the real world without recourse to fantasy. I mean, it's too easy in fantasy. If you've got wizards, you can just invent a spell that would explain things. In real life, really strange things do happen. We don't always understand what they are. And how we deal with them, I think, does reveal quite a lot about how, what we're like as people.
One of the things that you mentioned Charles Fort in this book, if I'm not mistaken, and so when you say strange things happen, we can't explain them. That is straight out of Charles Fort, and he's a really interesting fellow. His approach to things, I think, was very useful. Talk about who he was and how he informs this book, and also the collecting aspect of this book, because I have been guilty of having, piles of old 40 and Times magazines. I think they're still out in the garage, if I'm not mistaken.
Well, Charles Fort was obviously a very interesting character. Um, I, I like the idea. I mean, I was brought up in the 1970s watching Uri Geller on the television being taken seriously by everyone. And there would be documentaries on UFOs and the Loch Ness Monster. And we were all expected in the 1970s to take these things relatively seriously. And I did. I went out and I bought the first book I bought to try and understand these things. That was actually one of the paperbacks by Lobsang Rampa. I didn't get on with him at the time. In fact, I still don't get on with him particularly. But I then found Colin Wilson wrote a book called a man called Grant, The Directory of Possibilities, and slowly realized that just about all of it was bunkum and rubbish, but there was generally something behind it all that never is quite explained. And even when it is explained, it's someone, even if it's a hoax, the hoaxer is of interest. Why did they create that hoax? So all these things have carried on being fascinating to me, even though I know most of it is rubbish. But it still has this sort of fascination.
One of the things that you talked about, working out things in the real world. In this novel, that's one of the things that really I just love, because once this impossible event, body falls on their house, they're out in the middle of nowhere. I think where you live, probably Yorkshire Dales. There's no forest nearby. There's no trees. Planes don't typically fly there, and if they do, they're pretty noticeable. This impossible thing happens to them. Then the police come and they have to deal with it. And I love that, because in a way, this book becomes very much like a cozy supernatural mystery. But the characters are not cozy or sweet.
No, I think it is fairly realistic, but behind it, I won't explain what the MacGuffin is. There is something that's causing all this to happen, and which is I've borrowed from Arthur Machen. Um, but yeah, how we deal with these things. I mean, I've had one supernatural experience in my life. I don't believe it was a ghost, but I can't explain it.
What would
And
you mind sharing it with us?
no, I was at Rosalie, my wife, her family farm. Her brother still is there, and they've been farming it for several generations. And they have what they call the piano room or the music room, where they used to have musical lessons, and they would always talk about there being a ghost that would play any musical instrument that was in there. And I'd been visiting for about 25, 30 years. And in the middle of the night, if I woke up and needed to get a glass of water, I would go down into the music room, hoping to scare myself or see or hear something. And I never did. And then one day we were there with our son and their son, and we were mucking around on the piano and just playing a little piano part. And it was all very, very good fun. It was the middle of the day, it was a sunny day. It was lunchtime, so we all went into the kitchen to make lunch. We were all in the kitchen, and from the piano room, those few notes that we'd been playing on the piano were played back to us. And it wasn't scary, it was just very, very odd. And I looked at Roz and I looked at Diana, my sister in law, who experienced this before as well. And they said, "Ah, you've heard it then." And that's all it was. And it wasn't scary, but it is inexplicable. I don't know why and how it happened.
Well, that's one of the things I love about this book is that weird things do happen, but they're not scary or awful, but they're informative. One of the things I think that this book does expertly is externalize the interior conflicts of the characters with the help of the supernatural and the weird events. So continue. You were talking about weird using the weird events in this book.
Well, again, I don't want to give too much away, but when a particular character appears and doesn't realize that she was meant to have died a year ago, she hopefully acts as anyone else would. She doesn't believe it. Um, as far as she's concerned, time has passed and someone has been ransacking her house and sort of making free with her possessions. And hopefully, again, she is then experiencing something obviously very supernatural, but reacting as most of us would do, which is to be surprised and affronted and quite angry. And yes, it carries on getting stranger and stranger.
Now, one of the things this book digs into a bit is book collecting. I'm looking at you. You're surrounded by beautiful bookshelves filled with know to be beautiful books. I'm surrounded. There's a few bookshelves in this room too, though they're not happily visible. So talk about this book as discussing the interest and ethics of book collecting and what that can lead to.
Well, it was in the character of Catherine and her house. It was inspired by the house of a friend. I won't mention his name. He passed away a few years ago, and he was a researcher, and he had a huge book collection. And unfortunately, he had lost some of his storage not long before he died, and he had to move all the books into the house. And yes, it was absolutely stuffed with books. Unfortunately, when he passed away, because there were sort of people in the house, it started getting untidy incredibly quick. And I remember standing there and trying to explain to someone, no, there's no way that his house would have looked like this when he was here. He would have known where all the books were. He would have known that, okay, they're double stacked, but he would know on which shelf in which room the books would have been. It's other people that have made a mess of what he had. Because book collectors may look as though their collections are getting out of hand, some of them, but they're not. They are, carefully curating them. I'm actually quite lucky in that my wife Ros, she reads books and she then gets rid of them. She doesn't need to keep them. She doesn't need to reread them. And I've got into the habit of pruning books like she does. So I haven't let my book collection get out of hand. And after I saw this friend's house, I thought, no, I'm going to really carry on being good like this. It does mean every now and again I will reach for a book and think, it's not there. I've got rid of it, which is incredibly frustrating. So there's probably 3 or 4 books that I have bought 3 or 4 times because I've needed to read them. And a few years later, realized they weren't there when I want to reread them again.
Yeah, that's my problem with getting rid of things. I get rid of things and then I think, I need that now. And I am buying it again. Um, Talk a little bit about, what happens when you become a hoarder. And um, I, I know some people who were very interested in tracking the stock market and correlating that with astrology. And so when they passed, we went to a bedroom. It was just stacked with newspapers. And you're thinking, wow, nobody can use any of that stuff. And I think you capture that very well when um Tanya and her husband, and mostly just Tanya, explore her friend Catherine's house. Her friend Catherine has died, and since it happens early in the novel, we'll just say she's the one who falls on the roof, and when they go to look at her house, it looks pretty scary.
Yeah, I did draw upon a few examples of hoarders that I've come across, but also maybe it must have been about 1995. We moved into a house I kind of part inherited from a distant uncle, and he kept newspapers, and we could not work out why he needed all these old newspapers. And I remember we flung open one of the upstairs windows, and we were just throwing all these newspapers out. And there was, in his mind, there was a reason for keeping them. Hoarders, even at the most extreme end of the scale, don't realize they're hoarding, that they are actually doing something useful. They know at some point those things are going to be of value to them again. And I think book collectors are probably worse than no, they're not worse. They books take up a lot of room and can be a lot of weight on floorboards and joists. But I think most book collectors do really intend to refer to those books again. And it's one of those things you can keep putting in bookcases and they can look quite smart, and books do furnish a room, and then the piles start sort of appearing in the corners. I think it's when you start sort of filling up the bathtub, that's when you know that things are getting out of hand.
One of the things I think that you deal with really interestingly in this book, and that's this is an example of what one of the reasons I like this book was it really treated modern life in a way that was like very realistic yet fun. Was you talk about the internet, chat rooms and the kind of poisonous behavior that happens there, and capture it very well. And also, may I say, you and your wife put in an appearance at a funeral, and I'm guessing that you show up later as one of the members of a forum dedicated to an author. So it's my guess is you had a lot of fun running the internet chat room chats.
I probably had slightly too much fun and had to remove some. I am very, very pleased that, people talk about Facebook as being sort of a horrible place, and the only people I interact with on Facebook are lovely people. But in around about 2000, there was a chat group which really did get quite poisonous. And I would come to my computer in the morning and turn it on and see what had been argued overnight, and would talk to my wife about, well, shall I answer these things that have been said about me? And she would say, no, ignore them. And I'm so glad that she persuaded me not to join in, because it's so easy to get sort of sucked into these arguments. And the arguments that I saw back then really did inform what I created. But I am, yeah, as I say, I'm very pleased that I don't really see that anymore. And the only sort of internet chat forums I do look at tend to be sort of, pretty well mannered on the whole.
One of the things I think you do really well in those sections are create, a pretty big gallery of characters, and I'd like you to just talk about, keeping track of the characters and how they interact with each other, and how one post follows the other, and the quotes. I mean, that's some really intricate stuff, and I have to say that given all the stuff that's in this book, it's a page turner and it's really short, and so, but it doesn't feel overstuffed. So talk about editing this so that it sounds really nice. I mean, it's a thrill to read.
Well, I'm really glad that you liked it. It it did worry me that it was a bit all over the place with having the internet chat discussions, but they were very important in sort of illuminating a side of the character of Catherine, because she was giving as good as she was getting from people, and some of it was really quite unpleasant. But I do think that people have so many different sides to them. We don't always see, the little old lady walking down the road, or the chap with the dog who always says hello, may well be sort of on the internet researching some very weird and wonderful things, and saying some weird and wonderful things. I mean, there's people here in the village where I live who, some of them say some appalling things on the internet, and when we meet in the street, they are the nicest people you ever meet. I think people do have that ability, which is a real shame. But I just enjoyed dropping in things like the little bits of autobiography which Catherine was meant to have written on, that Tanya discovers, and puts on a flash drive and takes home. Part of me really likes the old-fashioned way of life, and I like classic ghost stories and end of fiction from the 1890s and the Edwardian times. But you can still get that atmosphere and feel, and still have a high-speed internet connection being used, I'm sure.
Well, this book is certainly evidence of that. And the other thing I think is, in terms of plotting, I guess you said it earlier, you just make it up as you go, but I think you do a fantastic job of starting with, this one impossible event. And then by the time you get to the second event, impossible event, it's believable. You've already kind of set that up so that, and then the third comes faster, and then it starts really like switching up to at a fairly high speed. Talk about plot using impossible events to create a propulsive plot that yet remains realistic and believable.
I think that I did, although I write as I go along, the editing process is incredibly important. I never used to like editing. I enjoy it much more now. But I was very aware that I didn't want to introduce a second improbable event too soon, but I didn't want to lose people's interest in the characters and what was going on. So probably about a third of the writing was taken out just to get the pacing right. So there are bits, I mean, there was more of the internet chat discussions, and I thought, no, I was just getting a bit too self-indulgent. It was more about pacing than anything else, making sure that things came along at the right sort of time.
Now, you earlier mentioned Arthur Machen, and also I think you do a good job of using the Lovecraftian vibe of referring to a text by Solinus, and I looked this up. Called the
Polyhistor. Yes, yeah,
Polyhistor, yeah, and that's a real document. So,
yeah. I'm lucky enough to have a copy, and
wow,
it's an amazing book because I came across it because Arthur Machen has something called the 60 Stone in the novel of the Black Seal. The Black Seal is mentioned in Solinus. So I've managed to track down a copy after many, many years of looking. And it's a fascinating book. It's basically everything about the world as it was known at the time, sort of in the 1600s, 1500s. So they didn't know a huge amount, but it also has, is the wonderful thing is it has a map, and the map carries on beyond Asia and shows the start of a landmass. And it's popularly thought of as being the first time that America appears on a map. It's a wonderful book. Uh, Unfortunately, I don't read Latin, but I do have a thing on my phone which will translate it for me, which is great.
well, one of the things too is the very title of the book, Polyhistor,
Mm.
makes me at least think of multiple timelines, and that's certainly a part of this book. And as I once I finished this book, I thought, my God, he this is the best time out of joint book since Slaughterhouse-Five. And that I thought, what a great guy and vision to bring into this kind of world, this kind of supernatural, research-oriented world, looking at the past, the quiet libraries like the one you're sitting in now, to bring in kind of the wildness of Kurt Vonnegut. Was that something that you thought of when you were writing it?
No, it's one of those great things about writing. You drop in a few references for a particular reason, and a different reader will pick up another thing. So, no, the idea of polyhistor and multiple histories, I didn't think of that. Thank you very much. I'll work it into my next interview and claim all the credit.
Too, as I read this book, one of the things I liked were, the characters who are not so good, and this is Mr. Nichols and the man he knows who buys this big house. Talk about creating antagonists who are themselves pretty fallible, yet menacing, because we're always presented with somebody like Hannibal Lecter that you're only going to meet that guy once.
Well,
But there are not that many people. There are identifiably probably not so many Hannibal Lecters and more guys. Your characters could almost be out of The Office.
um, it's one of those things that I mean, the characters sort of come alive, even if I've pinched something from somebody I know. And in the book dealing world, there are so many characters that even when I may sort of purloin someone's attitude towards particular books or the way they look, they very quickly have to do something which I know they wouldn't do, and then they take on their own personalities. But especially in the book dealing world, there are characters who push the limits sometimes of what is acceptable behavior, and I can understand why. I mean, they're trying to make a living, and when you start sort of being a specialist in something and going down all those rabbit holes, and they start becoming very important to you, then certain sort of behavioral norms go out of the window. I think that's true to say.
You know, part of the charm of this book is the location and the descriptions. The description of Catherine's house then and now is really powerful, especially by the time we encounter it then. We've already seen it now in its completely destroyed state. and you bring it back to this beautiful life, and I'd like you to talk about that. Was that um, a scene that it seemed like that had a lot of emotion? It has a lot of emotional resonance for the reader. Did that
Yeah.
happen to you as you wrote it?
Well, I've always loved houses, old houses especially. And I ended up training and actually I became an architect, not for very long. I did my 7 years training and qualified. And I then became a publisher. But I got into it because I loved old houses. And just before I went to university, my parents were thinking about moving, and they looked around some big old houses, which they were never going to afford because it was great fun. And they were lovely old houses that were in a bit of a state usually. I found it incredibly romantic. And I based her house on a house in the village where I was brought up. And I remember it being a wonderful place, a really nice old half tile hung sort of 15th century house. But I'm also fascinated, and I'm sucked in too often on places like Facebook into seeing groups that look at abandoned houses, and I find them incredibly painful um, when you see sort of ceilings collapsed and piles of books and furniture. Um, it's the saddest thing in the world when that happens. So I was kind of wanting to recreate and bring her rather wrecked house back to life when it was loved, and when people would have very fond memories of how it had been. And that's what I used to do with some of the houses I looked around with my parents, sort of try and recreate in my mind what they were like when people lived there and loved it, loved being there.
Well, one of the things too that's extremely powerful in this book is that you speak to the power of memory, and we like to think of memory as being like a series of VHS tapes in our brain, and we pull out the VHS tape and it plays, what happened. But that's not what happens. What happens is that we have some core slight idea, word, and association, and then we use our brain and our imagination sometimes more than we understand to recreate the whole event. Talk about the power of imagination and the part it plays in memory and the way you use that in this book.
I find it absolutely fascinating because there have been times in my life when I've talked to people about very important events for them and for me, and we remember certain details completely differently. One of us has to be wrong, but they're important events. I've recently been talking to an old school friend, and I'm writing about he has become religious and joined a church. And back in the 90s, he came to talk to me about what he believed. And I've written about that meeting and what we discussed. He has no memory of us meeting and talking at all. It wasn't as important to him as it was to me. And then I also remembered his church being in Sussex. They came to visit. They were a London-based, well, in fact, they're a Nigerian church, but their sort of London Bethel came down to Sussex. And one evening in Lewes, we were driving to meet them where they were having a meeting in the grounds of Lewes Castle. And it was very incongruous because most of the members of the church were black, and they wear long white soutanes, and they were running across the road with chairs to take into where we were all going to sit. And they looked like members of the Ku Klux Klan, but they were black. It was a very incongruous sort of thing that we were seeing, and we talked about it, my wife and I at the time. Now, that is entirely correct. But over the years of telling people and mentioning the Ku Klux Klan, when I talked to him, I said that they were wearing hats, big white pointy hats. They've never worn those hats. That's entirely in my imagination. I was utterly wrong. I've made it up. And yet, all these years, I thought that that was a real memory. It couldn't have been. And various things like that have happened, both for myself and other people telling me things where I've got proof that they're wrong, or they got proof that I was wrong. And then added to that, I've been writing about Robert Aikman, and I've been kind of obsessing on one little detail. He founded the Inland Waterways Association with LTC Rolt, and they met on a boat. And Aikman made a big thing of their meeting and how idyllic it was and how beautiful it was. But he doesn't mention in his autobiography that his wife was there, but I'd worked out she had to have been. He wrote her out the story because, well, for various reasons, but it didn't fit that there were other people there. And I then found that there was another couple that they knew, mutual friends, who were also at this meeting. But he's romanticized and idealized the whole thing, and that's become the history, and that's what people talk about, the two great men meeting. And it's not right. But whether he had forgotten those people, or after all the years of telling the story, or whether he willfully removed them, I've no idea.
And in your novel, you write, it hurt her pride that Catherine claimed the credit for her review. It wasn't exactly how Tanya remembered events, but she had to concede she probably discussed the rejected review with Catherine and may well have asked for advice. With Tom's earlier comment in mind, she conceded that neither of their memories could probably be trusted on this, considering that time had passed, but she was sure that Catherine was manipulating the facts. And I think that you get that one of these passages where you get straight to the core of the way that, in a sense, as we talk with the people we know, we create a new world and a new timeline and a new story for ourselves every time we open our mouths.
I've read various commentators suggesting that when you access a memory and talk about it, it's like that gets wiped, and then you store the new version of the memory so it can carry on changing. I've no idea whether that's correct or not, but it kind of feels right, because changes do creep in.
And that goes right with your love of editing the manuscripts. We edit the manuscript of our lives in a sense, and that's really what this one of the ideas at the core of this book is. But I think that it also speaks to that the idea that of that Carly Simon song, which is these are the good old days. That even as we speak and experience what we think are flaws and problems and blah 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 blah, and we're going to remember those 10 years from now and think, oh my God, that was so wonderful.
I think one of the things we do is we edit out all the boring stuff in between the important events. So although we will remember the great things, the great parties, the great friends, and the great events, we'll also remember, tragedies, deaths, horrible accidents, things like that. But the everyday getting up and going to work tends to get edited out, and for good reason.
Well, that's, I think, one for me, that this novel really captures that. And I love the one of the ideas you use in this, and I think you do it really well, is this one of the many ideas that occurs in this book is the idea of body swapping. And so I think you write about that really well. On one hand, you absolutely capture the dissonance, and I guess this is based on our earlier conversation. This is dealing with something that I think that is really present in this world, which is imposter syndrome.
I think I distrust anyone who doesn't have imposter syndrome to a certain extent. Anyone who's really sure of themselves, steer well clear of. I really can't say that I've ever had an experience of swapping bodies with anyone. I mean, the whole thing is obviously fiction. In fact, I've just read Margarita Lasky's The Victorian Chaise Longue, which just so happens to be about someone who wakes up in Victorian times in someone else's body. So it's obviously done quite often. I mean, one of the great fantasies I'm sure all of us have had at some point is thinking, if I could wake up when I was 25 years younger and in that situation, how would I do things differently? Yeah, it is fascinating.
And two, uh, this book does do a good job of telescoping the ages of the characters so that you can put those two in juxtaposition. And I think that's one of the powers of the supernatural MacGuffin you have at the heart of this. You referred to Arthur Machen earlier. How did he use the MacGuffin that you appropriated from from his book?
Well, in the novel The Black Seal, he has this black seal, uh, but he doesn't actually explain quite what it does or where it's from. And I thought, well, if I drop this into the first draft, I actually thought I'll take it out later. But for the moment, it does the job, and it had to stay. My idea was that it's obviously a bit of technology or some kind of spiritual thing or mystical thing or magical thing. I've no idea, which we don't understand. So it's not worth me trying to explain it. But it's the MacGuffin.
Well, I think that gets you use this stone, I think, exactly in the same way that Arthur C. Clarke once said, any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic, which was a line used to sell synthesizers by the company I used to work for. And I think that this is true. And one of the characters who's, I think, kind of in the background, and you think he's going to stay in the background, but he actually comes out, is the character of the writer Heldeman. And I love this guy. I mean, I've read back in the day, I would just buy the cheesiest looking books I could find. Uh, just to say, oh wow, that looks really fun. So talk about creating, a horror writer, and you have a lot of fun with him.
Yeah, he was one of the things that got edited out quite a lot because I had too much fun recreating his very purple prose. Yeah, I've actually, again, it was one of those things that I put in the first draft. He wasn't going to be called Heldman later on. I was going to change it because I've pinched his name from Richard Marsh's original name. Richard Marsh wrote The Beetle. And but unfortunately, I'd written so much purple prose for him. As I say, most of it is out that I actually came to quite like him, and that was his name, and I couldn't change it. It would have been wrong. But yes, he was meant to be a sort of a pulp writer who would have been fairly insufferable, who churned out, as you say, sort of cheesy, overblown rubbish back in the day, and sort of now would have a sort of a cult following online. With people who would be, kind of appropriating him for themselves, which is what Catherine has done. She's meant to be administering the estate, and there are fans out there who feel that she's not doing it correctly. That's based on sort of my understanding and recognition of various writers and their estates and their fans.
I think that that's another aspect of this novel that's really interesting. And I think that this goes across this entire novel. There are things you bring them up in enough detail so that we can really think about them, but they don't overtake the novel. And that must have been tough. I imagine, well, and one thing I was going to ask, have you considered writing a Heldeman novel?
No, yeah, he is meant to be a bit of a joke, I have to admit.
But as far as the interactions of the fans, I think you really nailed that. And talk about creating fans who obsess over their writers or the artists they love so much that they somewhat undermine their own interest.
Yes, well, there is one person from the past that I had in mind who felt that the supernatural genre was his domain. This is many years ago, and ended up in a very bad place, arguing and dragging a lot of people into these arguments. And some of the people who he obviously had a few problems, but other people who were perfectly reasonable human beings, very decent folk, then felt that they had to defend certain writers and took it very personally. It was like it was a personal attack on them because they were writers that they had didn't just associate with but sort of admired. And yeah, it was a personal attack as far as they were concerned, and they then started acting sort of mirroring the bad behaviour. Um, to say I could well have got dragged into that, and I'm really glad that I didn't, because I do understand.
Now, this is, I think, one of the things that I love about Tartarus books is that they are beautiful books. And who did the
Thank you.
cover?
The illustration is a chap called Tim Stevens, I was hoping could have illustrated another book of ours that never quite came off, and he offered to do the illustration for me, which he did for both the cover and the boards. And I don't credit him in the book for the boards, which he should get credited for. So I'll rectify that now.
Um, Now, as a publisher, you have a wonderful history. You have singularly resurrected a couple of great writers, Robert Aikman and Arthur Machen. So talk about making the choice to, just discover the past, but also you've broken some amazing writers, for the future, Angela Slatter and Mark Valentine. So talk about, balancing the past and the future as a publisher.
Well, we started off Tartarus Press purely to bring back into print works by Arthur Machen because I was a fan. And I think we can take some credit for having sort of pushed the Arthur Machen bandwagon on, and now he's very widely published and much better known. I think with Robert Aikman, that was much more a case of very good luck. We happened to ask for permission for the rights to publish Aikman. After there had been a few years of sort of legal limbo, we happened to be the first people to come along. I think other people would have published him if we hadn't been there. So we can take some credit, but I think he would have found the place that he has now. But as for contemporary writers, a lot of that is down to Rosalie Parker, my other half, my wife and editor. She would have received Angela Slatter's first book in the submissions pile, just as she did Andrew Michael Hurley's The Loney, which was probably the biggest hit that we've had. But others has been, Mark Valentine is a wonderful writer. I've just known Mark since the 1980s through the old Arthur Machen Society, and seen his writing and tastes and interests develop. And it's been great fun to be publishing a friend who we know and we see regularly. Whereas some other writers, we've just published a wonderful novel by Hannah Gammon, who's in South Africa. We probably will never meet Hannah. She's that far away. It's a combination of being in the right place at the right time and hopefully spotting writers of quality.
What is in the future for you, both as a writer and as a publisher?
We try not to announce what we're publishing in advance, because whenever we do, we jinx whatever we mention. The book doesn't come out for another couple of years or doesn't come out at all. So we have a collection of short stories by one of our contemporary writers coming out next year, and we're resurrecting a classic writer from the late Victorian and Edwardian times, a woman writer. if I tell you what they are and when they're going to come out, something will go wrong. You know, the printers
I
will
fully
interrupt.
understand that. I
uh,
have,
Sorry.
well, I was gonna say, I have taken I will never announce an interview until it is done, completed, edited, and just about ready to air.
That is very, very sensible.
Yes.
And as for myself, I've got I, I was writing a series of essays about people who have unbelievable beliefs. I've always been interested in people who believe things that can't be sort of seen and heard or touched. People who have faith, but people who have faith in things which perhaps are provably impossible. And one of those was I started writing about Lobsang Rampa, who wrote The Third Eye back in 1956, and was then exposed as not being a Tibetan monk, but being the son of a plumber from Devon. And what started off as a short essay has become a biography, and the other essays in the book are sort of are kind of appendices in the back. But I'm hoping that will come out sometime next year.
I am looking forward to that. I have been speaking with Ray Russell. His new novel is The Woman Who Fell to Earth. Thank you for joining me, Ray.
Thank you. It's been good fun.
Okay, now we can stop recording. There we go.